I mentioned in the previous video that the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis was ultimately damaging for Nikita Khrushchev back in the Soviet Union. Essentially, to a lot of people, it looked like he had, at the same time, been both dangerous and weak. Dangerous in the fact that he agreed to establish these nuclear missile sites in Cuba. That was inevitably going to provoke a reaction from the United States. And then weak in some ways for not following through with it. Especially for having the Soviet ships to turn around and not confront US blockade of Cuba. So that wasn't necessarily the view that every single person had, but some people felt Khrushchev had been dangerous in what he had done in the first place. Other people felt he had been weak for backing down. In other words, if you're going to put in these nuclear missile sites, you need to follow through and send a clear lesson to the Americans. In particular, the fact that the important part of the trade-off, that the American missiles in Turkey would be withdrawn. The fact that was secret also kind of helped those who had an issue with Khrushchev, because it really looked like he hadn't gained all that much as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Furthermore, Khrushchev's move away from Stalinism, his rejection of Stalinism, angered the Chinese. So China obviously by this stage was a communist state led by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a loyal follower of Stalin, in particular Stalin's idea of there being an inevitable conflict between communism and capitalism, that there would be a battle for world domination between both forces. The fact that Khrushchev, for the most part, was trying to thaw relationships with the West, to try and have a more positive relationship, was seen by China as a kind of betrayal of that idea, which was another reason that made Khrushchev unpopular. That it looked like he was kind of flip-flopping in terms of his attitude towards the United States. He was alienating the largest communist ally that the Soviet Union had, and a lot of people became unhappy with him. And so in 1964, he was essentially overthrown in a coup and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who planned to adhere much more closely to the Stalinist model, not so much in terms of gulags and out and out totalitarian dictatorship in terms of using the terror tactics that Stalin had, so not so much in that aspect, but certainly in the idea of maintaining a kind of hostility towards the West and suppressing any kind of efforts towards political or economic reform in the Soviet Union. But I guess as proof of that, the fact that Khrushchev was overthrown, he essentially was forced to retire. He wasn't murdered or anything as a result of this. So again, that's showing that the Soviet Union, at least in terms of his move away from terror tactics, was taking a step in the right direction. But which is not to say that the Soviet Union did not have pretty clear and obvious totalitarian impulses at time. And perhaps the best example of this came in Czechoslovakia. So in January 1968, a moderate communist, Alexander Dubček, became Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia. And he planned a number of reforms. One of them was to divide Czechoslovakia into two allied republics, so the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. So they would remain part of the one state, but they would be administrated differently, which reflected the fact that Czechoslovakia, or the Czechs and Slovak people saw themselves as ethnically somewhat different, reflecting the fact that to this day the Czech Republic and Slovakia are separate countries. Also allowing political parties to form, potentially working with these non-communist political parties and forming a government, allowing more free speech, and allowing for a shift in the economy away from heavy industry towards creating more consumer goods, and allowing a certain amount of free market policies as well. Obviously, these were very controversial ideas to the Soviet Union, especially to Brezhnev, who believed in sticking much more closely to the Stalinist line of no free speech, an economy that's completely centrally controlled by the government, and which heavy industry, not consumer goods, is its main focus. So the Soviet Union becomes more and more alarmed at the proposals that Dubček is making, and in August 1968 they send in an army of over 200,000 men, initially eventually came up to 500,000 men, not actually just exclusively soldiers from the Soviet Union, soldiers from other Warsaw Pact countries as well, although the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union kind of split the Warsaw Pact. Some countries didn't contribute soldiers because they felt that this was wrong. Romania, for example, under Nicolae Ceausescu, which was a communist dictator, felt that Dubček deserved the right to kind of form its own policies and shouldn't be invaded by the Soviet Union as a result. So it actually split the Warsaw Pact to some extent. In fact, Albania, which had been a part of the Warsaw Pact, completely leaves at this stage and really breaks the final kind of tenets of collaborative relationship it had with the Soviet Union. The Czech people themselves engage in massive non-resistance. You see this picture here. This is from the Prague Spring, where people stood in front of tanks to stop them moving. People removed road signs, held mass demonstrations. Very famously, some people in Czechoslovakia began self-immolating, that is, dousing themselves in gasoline and setting themselves on fire. The most famous example of this was a guy called Jan Palach, who self-immolated, burned himself to death as a protest against the Soviet invasion. And actually, for a time, this caused the Soviets to pause. They realized that their actions were very, very unpopular. And so they allowed Dubček to remain as prime minister for a time being, although they brought him to Moscow and interrogated him and forced him to agree that he should become more moderate in his policies. It wasn't until April 1969, 8 months after the invasion began, that the Soviets felt they had enough control of the situation to replace Dubček. And again, when I say replace him, they made him go work as a forestry official in Czechoslovakia. He wasn't murdered or anything like that. But so efforts to reform reform the communist countries in the Soviet Union are still met by armed tanks and soldiers. And that kind of marks the fact that Leonid Brezhnev in particular very much believes in ensuring that no nation break away from the Warsaw Pact, because that was part of his fear that the Czechs were about to leave the Warsaw Pact, which probably wasn't likely. Dubček understood that would be a major red line for the Soviet Union, but nevertheless his reforming efforts promoted the Soviet Union to move in and eventually push him out of power. However, the Cold War undergoes a period that's known as détente, kind of an easing of tensions between the powers in the 1970s. One of them was the fact that these two countries building up nuclear weapons were essentially placing enormous strains on their own economy. The principle of mutually assured destruction, known as MAD, the basic idea was, what were the Soviets and the United States aiming for in war? Well, they wanted to build up enough weapons that neither side would attack the other, because they knew they would be destroyed in retaliation in terms of an attack. So this was mutually assured destruction, essentially the principle that stopped nuclear war breaking out between both sides, because both sides understood that it would essentially have destroyed both countries had a war broken out. But the fact that both countries had to maintain this very large nuclear arsenal, constant innovation, or focusing resources on innovating and developing new nuclear weapons, placed a heavy burden on both economies. Politically, late 1960s, early 1970s, both sides were kind of suffering from diplomatic defeats. The Vietnam War, as most of you are probably aware, had gone very badly for the United States, had created a great deal of social division within the United States itself, had really damaged America's international reputation around the world, whereas the Soviet Union had an issue that the ongoing kind of tension between the Chinese and the Soviets, what I have here is the Sino-Soviet split, also offered the potential for war. In fact, in 1969, a series of border clashes between the Soviet Union and China, and if you don't know, the Soviet Union and China had a very extensive land border, left a couple of hundred soldiers dead. And so, from the Soviet point of view, it made sense to try and have a better working relationship with the United States, just in case a conflict with China ever actually fully broke out and resulted in a major conflict between the two communist powers. So, starting in the early 1970s, nuclear or talks took place between the American government under Richard Nixon and the Soviet Union, trying to kind of introduce some limitations on how many nuclear weapons both sides had. These became known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the SALT talks. So the first was signed in 1972, where both sides kind of agreed to try and lessen the number of nuclear weapons they had in order to take the pressure off their own economies. When James Carter became president of the United States in 1976, he opened up further negotiations with the Soviet Union that led to a signing of a second SALT talks in 1979. This was never ratified by the Senate, where conservative opposition prevented it being ratified. In particular, the conservatives in the Senate were worried that if the SALT II talks were ratified, that eventually the Soviet Union would have more nuclear weapons than the United States, that there would be, to use an expression at the time, a missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. Meanwhile, an example of cooperation kind of away strictly from nuclear weapons was the Helsinki Accords in 1975, which wasn't signed exclusively between the United States and the Soviet Union. A large number of countries took part in the Helsinki Accords, promising to guarantee human rights and to promote peaceful resolutions of disputes and avoid future conflicts. And so there was a hope for a time that the Helsinki Accords would lead to better human rights record in the Soviet Union and remove the potential of further armed Soviet interventions in countries where there was an issue that the Soviets had. However, this era of détente kind of ended by the late 1970s. In 1980, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. A communist takeover of Afghanistan, as communist rebels had seized control in Afghanistan in the late 1970s. They were confronted by Islamist rebels who want to overthrow the communist government. And if you're not aware, communism is very much an anti-religious ideology, very much hostile to religion. Afghanistan was a primarily Islamic country, and so therefore many people felt that a communist takeover of Afghanistan was bad for Islam, dangerous for Islam, and so they staged a rebellion. And in order to support the communist government in Afghanistan, the Soviets invaded the country in 1980. Meanwhile, the United States, Ronald Reagan had been elected president. He had very much won his campaign in part because he promised to end the kind of era or end the thaw basically in the Soviet-American relationship. He felt that the United States needed to be kind of stronger in confronting the Soviet Union, needed to build up its arms again, that the strategic arms limitation talks were a mistake, and therefore the United States needed to have a more kind of confrontational policy with the Soviet Union. So that brings us up to the early 1980s in the Cold War, that the period of détente in the 1970s was ended, and by early 1980s, it looked like the hostile relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States was set to continue for decades to come.